Thank you very much, Professor Majumdar, for your words of introduction. I felt and feel that we should remember the work and life of P.W. Anderson, who was one of the epochal figures in physics of the last half a century. I'm very thankful for this opportunity, and I have an excuse. The excuse is that P.W. Anderson passed away about 3 months ago at the age of 96. He was a theoretical physicist, perhaps the greatest condensed matter physicist of the second half of the 20th century. When he started his work, which was in the early 1950s, the field was quite obscure and was not highly regarded. As a matter of fact, the great Niels Bohr had not even heard of solid state physics, which was its major component, and the great Pauli used to call it solid state physics or dirt physics. Largely and perhaps mainly due to the foundational work and influence of P.W. Anderson, this field rose to prominence and is considered both useful and deep. What I will try to do is to communicate a sense of this by describing his general professional stance, outlining some of his contributions to physics and his espousal of emergence as central to science. But first, I would like to show some pictures which show what he looked like, and then I will say something about his broad life trajectory. Well, this is Anderson in his 20s. This is Anderson in his 40s with his wife and life partner Joyce. This is Anderson in his 60s in a meeting in ICTP, or the International Center for Theoretical Physics, in Trieste, Italy, with some Indian participants. This is Anderson in the evening of his life in his 80s. His personal and social life, the outer life, is like that of any distinguished US academic. He was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, in December 1953. His family background was that of impecunious but secure Midwestern academics, according to him. He was brought up in a farm near Urbana, Illinois, where his father was a professor of plant pathology. He says in his biographical sketch that his happiest hour as a child and adolescent were spent hiking, canoeing, vacationing, picnicking, and singing around the campfire, the group of warm, settled friends of his parents. He went to school in Illinois, Urbana. He was an undergraduate at Harvard and did his PhD there. His bulk of his professional life was spent in Bell Labs from 1949 to 1984. He was associated with Princeton after 1975, joined in the beginning till 1984. He was a full-time professor till 1996 and was an emeritus professor after that. He held visiting academic appointments at Kyoto, Cambridge, and other places like Oxford. He was an active liberal in his social life. For example, he put up posters saying "Stop the bombing" in Bell Labs during the Vietnam War, and was actually detained by the security of Bell Labs. He was also engaged in strong public criticism of the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan, which is popularly known as Star Wars. I would like to start with the general stance of his work. In this, two aspects seem to stand out for me. One is that observation and experiment are the motivating source of science. I quote from Anderson, which this quotation says that the philosophy of Francis Bacon, who is considered one of the founders of modern science, held that the knowledge of the nature of things was to be obtained from the acute observation of nature, not by the study of authoritative books or holy books. It is a fact that all of his contributions are motivated by some experimental fact or phenomenon, and also by a desire to understand it in a fundamental way. He intrinsically had this trait, and also was influenced by his formative experience in Bell Labs, about which he says, and I learned most of all the Bell mode of close experiment theory teamwork. The other large characteristic of Anderson is his belief that the description of the operating mechanism in a simple model is the crux of physics. He says this in his Nobel lecture in 1977. He says that one of my strongest stylistic prejudices in science is that many of the facts nature confronts us with are so implausible given the simplicities of non-relativistic quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics, that the mere demonstration of a reasonable mechanism leaves no doubt of the correct explanation. This is so, especially if it also correctly predicts unexpected facts. Very often, such a simplified model throws more light on the real workings of nature than any number of ab initio calculations of individual situations, which, even where correct, often contain so much detail as to conceal rather than reveal reality. It can be actually a disadvantage rather than an advantage to be able to compute or to measure too accurately, since often what one measures or computes is irrelevant in terms of mechanism, because after all, the perfect computation simply reproduces nature, it does not explain her. This is a picture of a litter of dogs, but the reason it is here is that it is common knowledge that the field of quantum condensed matter physics is littered with deceptively simple and deep Anderson models. Well, these puppies have grown up to be big dogs now. Well, I would like to start this physics part of this talk with an illustrative account of his work in magnetism, in disordered systems, and in superconductivity. His work on magnetism spans a wide range of time, from the early 1950s to the mid 1970s. He is, I would say, responsible for many of the foundational ideas of magnetism in condensed matter systems, which are quite alive and have shaped the field. To introduce, I would like to say that the magnetism of in atoms is overwhelmingly from the electrons, and we can picture these little atomic magnets for our purpose as little arrows, and these arrows point in a particular direction, like a bar magnet which has a north pole and a south pole, and maybe you can think of the tip of the arrow as being the north pole and the bottom of the arrow as the south pole. Now, it is observed that in nature there are two broad kinds of magnetic materials. One kind is the ferromagnetic, in which all these magnetic moments line up parallel to each other. The well-known example of this is a bar magnet of iron, or little magnets which are stuck on the fridge. These are mostly metallic. Then there is another broad family of magnetic materials in which these atomic magnets line up anti-parallel to each other on an atomic scale. This was first hypothesized by Néel in the 1930s. This kind of magnetism is not so apparent, but it is extremely common. It is what makes up the read head in the hard disk drive of your computer. It is found in garnets, ferrites, lodestone, and most of these antiferromagnetic materials are insulating. I just show a picture of these states of magnetism. Suppose you have a collection of atomic magnets, which are shown here by little arrows in a yellow background. If they are pointing in arbitrary directions because of some disorder, which could be thermal, then the substance is called paramagnetic. If the interaction between these atomic magnets overcomes the thermal disorder, then they line up parallel to each other, and this is a ferromagnetic. On the other hand, if the atomic magnets next to each other tend to line up anti-parallel to each other, as is shown in this figure, you have antiferromagnetism. If the two magnetic moments which tend to be anti-parallel to each other, they are not of the same size, then as is shown here, then the interaction between the magnetic moments can still be antiferromagnetic, but one of them lines up this way, the other one lines up this way, and you have a net magnetism because the sizes of the magnetic moments are not equal. Now, it has been a very long-standing question as to what the origin of this magnetism is. One of the founding figures of quantum physics, Heisenberg, showed that if you have two electrons which are identical in quantum mechanics, something called the quantum mechanical exchange between these two identical electrons is the source of ferromagnetism. This leaves open the question of what is the source of antiferromagnetism and why do they exist. Long back, Kramers sketched a particular mechanism somewhat hazily. It was in the 1930s. Anderson, throughout the period of 1950s in sustained work, gave life to this mechanism, which is called the super exchange mechanism and is known by the name of Kramers and Anderson. Anderson also identified the materials which show antiferromagnetism, the chemical families, their crystal structures, the systematics in their antiferromagnetic ordering, and connected each one of these with atomic level quantum realities such as orbitals. This sustained work actually not very consciously marks the birth of the physics of strong correlations, of which the great pioneer was Sir Neville Mott, after whom a particular family of insulators called Mott insulator is named. This is the physics of electrons, which, like maybe many human beings, have to live together, leaving each other severely alone. Just before this sustained work, which took Anderson almost the entire duration of 1950s, he did a very, I would say, work which presaged a number of developments in the field, and which he regarded as the seed of all his future work on emergence and European symmetry. He addressed a very embarrassing question, which has troubled a large number of physicists, which is, why is it that though antiferromagnetic order or antiferromagnets cannot be forever, we see them. We see antiferromagnets all around us, even though they cannot be forever. Now, why can't they be forever? Well, this is because, according to quantum physics, if you have two parallel atomic magnets, and they interact with each other, they will stay put. On the other hand, if you have two atomic magnets whose tendency is to be anti-parallel to each other, then one of them may point up and the other points down, or this points down and that points up. So the antiferromagnet will vacillate between these possibilities. So it is obvious, it has been obvious since the 30s, 1930s, that the observed antiferromagnetic arrangement of spins cannot stay put forever. But we know, I mean, we see them. So Anderson, in addressing, Anderson was the first person to address this question head on, and he imagined a new model which for the antiferromagnet, which shows that such a system can last for millions of years, though not forever. It is almost forever. It is like diamond. Diamond, the advertisement, an old advertisement says that diamonds are forever. But of course, we know that diamond is, let us say, less stable than graphite. This result of Anderson, this work of Anderson raises a question. The question is the following. One normally thinks of a molecule of ammonia in a broken symmetry way, in which the three hydrogen atoms are in a plane and the nitrogen is sitting on top of them or below them. This is actually not quite consistent with the inherent symmetry of the laws of motion of nitrogen and hydrogen electrons. Though the inversion between the two structures of ammonia, one with the nitrogen up and another with nitrogen down, takes place rather fast, 3 to the power 10 times per second, we still prefer to imagine it in the structure I have shown here. So one can ask the question as to whether this non-symmetric or broken symmetry way of thinking about even simple systems is just convenient, or this kind of a broken symmetry emerges and becomes real, as in a antiferromagnet. In an antiferromagnet, this kind of broken symmetry lasts for, well, so long as we can see. Anderson addressed an even more primary question in magnetism, which is why are there magnetic moments in condensed matter? This question is forced on one because the same magnetic atom, namely iron, is magnetic when dissolved in some metals like copper and is non-magnetic when dissolved in some other metals like aluminium. So the magnetic moment is not a very stable thing like it is in the magnetic moments of atoms. So thinking about this, Anderson invented a model which is now known as the Anderson model for localized moments in metals. This was one of the discoveries for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1977. This model of Anderson shows quantitatively how such a thing can happen by considering the competition between strong local electron repulsion, which stabilizes such moments, and the hybridization or mixing of the electrons which carry the magnetic moment with the free electrons of the metal. So if this hybridization is very strong, then the moment dies very fast. If the hybridization is weak, then the moment lives, but maybe not forever. A question which has been troubling physicists, as I said, and particularly Anderson, is whether there is a state of antiferromagnetically interacting atomic moments, which is an energetically stable alternative to the male antiferromagnet. Yes, indeed there is. And this is known as the resonating valence bond, which he investigated in 1973. This system is a quantum mechanically resonating collection of electron pairs which form a bond, let us say. And if you have a resonating collection of such pairs or such bonds, then the system is actually a magnetic liquid. It is an insulating magnet. This kind of idea had actually been proposed by Pauling as a model for metals, which is not particularly successful. However, the idea of Anderson that there ought to be magnetic systems with a resonating valence bond kind of arrangement has been a very powerful and stimulating idea. The hunt for such systems has been on for a very long time, and many very promising candidates have been located. And just a few days ago, I saw in a physics journal an article with the title of gapless ground state in the archetypal quantum Kagome antiferromagnet zinc copper chloride. Now, here, well, I mean, it's a mineral. It's a Herbert Smithite mineral, which was discovered in 2009, I think. And in a physicist idealization, it is a two-dimensional antiferromagnet coupled system in which the atomic magnetic moments, reside on copper. This idea of resonating valence bond somehow lodged in his mind, and it was reborn in 1987 as the resonating valence bond theory of high temperature superconductivity, which occupied him for the last 3 decades of his life. I will perhaps mention it later. The very last contribution to magnetism that I would like to mention is that there are a number of magnetic systems in which the atomic moments interact ferromagnetically with some of the neighbors and antiferromagnetically with some others. Now, this leads to frustration. This is where you can think of it as a kind of magnetic disordered material. You can ask, what is the fate of such systems? And Edwards and Anderson in 1975 proposed that these freeze, such frustrated magnetic systems freeze into a glassy configuration of magnetic moments at a particular temperature. They developed a new kind of statistical mechanics for describing the behavior of such systems. And it turns out that the methods and ideas they developed for this particular problem is of applicability to a wide range of systems all over science in which such frustration or disorder is inevitable. And this approach has given rise to a whole new science of complexity. Anderson had been fascinated by the consequences of disorder for other systems, in particular for electrons. And the consequences are observed. And in trying to understand these effects, he unearthed a phenomenon of localization of electrons, which is now known as Anderson localization, for which he was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1977. He was actually inspired in developing his ideas on electron localization by the results of Feher, his Bell Labs colleague, who studied the moments of phosphorus doped randomly in silicon, namely N-type silicon. He had found that when the amount of phosphorus in silicon is less than a certain level, then the magnetic moments of phosphorus in silicon stay put. Uh, Anderson invented a simple model for a different set of systems. That is, he developed a model for electrons with no magnetic moment hopping from one side to another in a lattice. The energy of this electron at each side is random. As this randomness increases, the electron diffuses more and more sluggishly in the increasingly disordered medium. What one might think naively is that as the medium becomes more disordered, the electron diffusion slows down and slows down and slows down. However, he found that diffusion suddenly ceases beyond a certain disorder. The electron is localized. We realize that this localization is due to the interference of the electron wave with a scattered counterpart, and therefore that it is common to all waves moving in disordered media. And the phenomenon of Anderson localization has been observed in sound waves, in light waves, in Rossby waves, which are planetary waves with wavelength of hundreds of kilometers, in the need for tumor detection in mammography. I show here an example of the localization of light. This shows light propagating in a disordered medium, and the peaks show the increased intensities of light at different positions. And on one axis is the wavelength of light. So different wavelengths of light get localized at different positions when propagating in this disordered optical medium. This work on Anderson localization was, I think, capped by the work on weak localization, which answered the questions of how does localization set in and how does it manifest itself in physical properties, especially electrical conductivity is easy to measure. About this, what Anderson says is that I was one of the gang of four with Abrahams, Ramakrishnan, and Don Licciardello, who revitalized that theory by developing a scaling theory which made it into a quantitative experimental science, precise predictions as a function of magnetic field, interactions, dimensionality, etc. A major branch of science continues to flow from the consequences of this work. The last thing I want to mention as his physics contribution is his far-reaching contributions to superconductivity. Now, superconductivity was discovered more than a century ago in 1911. It is the total absence of electrical resistivity, that is, total absence of resistance to the flow of electrical current, which is seen in many metals, more than half the elemental metals below a certain temperature. The theory of this, or the theoretical understanding of this at an atomic level, took almost 50 years. The discovery of this theory by Bardeen, Cooper, and Schrieffer electrified the physics community, and almost no one was immune from it. Anderson made many far-reaching contributions to it. I mentioned just two. One is what is called in condensed matter physics, it is called the Anderson-Higgs mechanism, and in some other parts of physics, it is called the Higgs mechanism. It was proposed by Anderson in 1962, and the relativistic quantum field theory for it was proposed by Higgs and others in 1964, and is directly applicable to particles, elementary particles. Anderson actually was one of the first people to realize that if there is superconductive order, then the phase of this superconductive order has important consequences. And one of the consequences is that if this order is coupled to electromagnetic fields, which it has to, because the order is of pairs of electrons which are charged, then the fluctuations of this order parameter field have a finite frequency. In the particle physics language, you would say that they are massive. And this is the Higgs boson, which was discovered in 2012. This is a very momentous discovery in physics, for which Higgs and Englert were given the Nobel Prize in 2013. This discovery is important not only in itself, but because it is believed widely that all the elementary particles in the universe acquire their masses by coupling to this field. The other effort in superconductivity, which is associated with Anderson, is the resonating valence bond theory of superconductivity, for which the seeds grew in Bangalore. As a matter of fact, in Bangalore, when Anderson had come to attend an international conference on valence fluctuations, the superconductivity occurring at unusually high temperatures in a set of unlikely oxides was discovered, had just been discovered. And the idea that the pair of electrons bonded together and a collection of these resonantly bonded with each other, resonating with each other quantum mechanically, and if you take this collection and dope it with holes which carry positive charge, then you have a metal, and that this metal becomes a superconductor. This is the idea behind the resonating valence bond theory of superconductivity. His long-standing major collaborator in this field has been Bhaskara. The basic premise of this theory is that there can be superconductivity with only repulsion between electrons and without any attraction, which binds two electrons to form a pair. And the earlier belief was that unless you have such an attractive glue which binds a pair of electrons, you cannot have the preconditions for superconductivity. His resonating valence bond theory of superconductivity is completely contrary to this, and is based on the belief, now I think considered a fact, that in these high temperature superconducting systems, the electrons repel each other quite strongly. The last foray into superconductivity is not a professional research, but it was an opinion piece by Anderson, relatively recent, about 2005. He made the following point. He pointed out that the pioneers of quantum physics, they believed that the domain of prominent quantum effects was atomic or subatomic, and that the human or macroscopic scale world is described accurately by classical physics. Anderson pointed out that London, alone among the quantum pioneers, clearly realized that quantum phenomena on a macroscopic scale are manifested in superconductors. Now, this observation is very important because the substrate of quantum matter and of quantum computing is the existence of quantum effects on macroscopic scales. Now, quantum computing and quantum matter are widely believed to be the coming thing. I believe that they've already come. The final thing I want to convey to you is that Anderson revitalized an old idea in science, which is the idea of emergence. The idea is the following, that we know that modern science is largely reductionist in practice and in its value systems. Sometimes this can be too much, and it was for Anderson. And in 1972, he wrote a very influential article called More is Different. This article which made the point that the ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws is not the same as the ability to start from these laws and to reconstruct the universe. And this clarion call, this belief, has empowered large areas of physics and of science and given them the essential self belief and intellectual moving. We realize that while reductionism is obviously necessary, it's not sufficient, and it's not the only thing. As a matter of reality, we are all emergentists as well as reductionists in varying degrees. This direction, married to experimental moorings, seems to me the one essential for the vigor and longevity of science. So let me just stop, conclude with an epilogue, which is a quotation from Anderson's book called A Career in Theoretical Physics. He says, the contribution of physics is the method of dealing with the substrate from which emergence takes place and with the emergent phenomenon itself. Ever newer insights into the nature of the world will continuously arise from this style of doing physics. Anderson was perhaps the greatest exemplar of this way of doing physics in the second half of the 20th century. I believe that, and I hope that for the sake of science, he was not the last. Thank you very much.